Hey there! Welcome to this tutorial about how to think about your data when you set it up in ChurchNumbers. It was Aristotle who said, "Well begun is half done." Or was it Mary Poppins? Well, in any case, the point is the same. It's beneficial to spend a little time thinking about how your data is structured before you start setting things up in ChurchNumbers. Certainly you can just dive right in and figure things out as you go along, and you could do a fair amount of restructuring after you've gotten started. But it's kind of like fixing your car while driving it across country. It's a lot easier to take it into the shop before you go on the trip. So to get started, let's try to understand how ChurchNumbers looks at data. The basic unit of information in ChurchNumbers is an event. You can think of an event as anything that happens and that creates a number of some kind. A worship service is a good example, as is a membership class. But it's not limited to events that take place at a particular time and place. An event could be the receipt of contributions or visits to a website. To learn more about the kinds of data you can record in ChurchNumbers, take a few minutes to watch the How It Works tutorial video if you haven't already. For each event, you need to record values for the date it occurred, plus the location, room, attendee type, event type, and time block, which we refer to as classifiers. Each event must have a date and values for at least 4 out of 5 classifiers. Kind of sounds like 4 out of 5 dentists, doesn't it? Anyway, you could ask, what's a classifier? Classifiers enable you to differentiate one kind of event from another, which is really important when you're trying to group, summarize, and present your data in the metrics on a dashboard. So let's talk about the classifiers in detail. The location is intended for multi-site churches to designate the campus or satellite where an event takes place. In dashboards, you can see data summarized for all locations or display the data for a single location. For a single-site church, you would generally just use the name of the church for your location. Remember that your base ChurchNumbers subscription includes one location. Each additional location incurs an extra monthly charge, so generally you don't want to use multiple locations for a single-site church. There are some cases where you might want to use one or more additional locations to differentiate events that take place somewhere off-site, but it's not really a separate campus. For example, a church offers worship services at several area senior living centers, and they want to track those as locations in ChurchNumbers. If you have a situation like that, let us know and we'd be happy to make the location or locations non-billable. Some multi-site churches might want to designate a location called Central for the purpose of tracking data that applies to the whole church. Again, this could be a case where a non-billable location would be appropriate, so please give us a call or email us and let us know what you're trying to accomplish. We'll be happy to help. The room is the only optional classifier. For events that don't take place in an actual room, you could use none. So it's required in the sense that it can't be blank, but you don't have to make up a room name where one doesn't exist. While it's true that you could use a generic name for all of your events, there's a great advantage to recording the actual room names in ChurchNumbers. Once your rooms are set up, you can set the capacity for each one, and then you'll be able to see on your dashboards which rooms are full and which ones aren't. Attendee type and event type are closely related, but as their names imply, a little bit different. Use attendee type to classify which people or demographic group is associated with each event. And use event type to designate the ministry or department for each event. Finally, the time block tells what time the event took place. Pretty simple, huh? You can name your time block whatever you want, 9 a.m., 10:30 to 11:30 a.m., first service, whatever. For some events that don't really take place at a particular time, like online donations, you could just use a time block named no time, or something like that. Something else about attendee type and event type. They are hierarchical. That's a complicated sounding word, but the basic idea is pretty simple. You can create groups or families of related attendee and event types. For example, you could create an attendee type called adults, and it works just fine by itself. But let's say you want to be able to create metrics that summarize data for different groups within your adult ministry. You create an attendee type, name it college, and make it a child of the adult attendee type by typing adults, then a semicolon, then college. You could go even deeper by creating freshmen as a child of college, which of course is a child of adults. But why? Or as the French would say, pourquoi? Because when you create metrics, you can make them so they look for events where the attendee type is adults, which would include all college students and freshmen, or you could make them look for college. That would include everyone in college, freshmen too, or you could just include freshmen, which would include everyone who's an adult in college who's a freshman, but exclude everyone else. You could do similar tricks with event types. Starting with an event type called formation, you could give it a child type called training, and then you could go a level deeper by creating another child type called classes. If this seems complicated, don't worry. You don't have to use these multi-level attendance and event types, but we want you to know that this capability is available, and we encourage you to experiment with it. So what's the point of classifiers, you ask? They are the secret sauce that make metrics work in ChurchNumbers. As you can imagine, the ChurchNumbers database could hold thousands or tens of thousands of event records for your church over many years. How does the software decide which ones to choose and calculate values in your metrics? Filters. And the primary filters are the three classifiers: attendee type, event type, and time block. What you're seeing here is a representation of the playground, which is the area in ChurchNumbers where you create and edit metrics. Now, since you might be thinking, this is the lamest playground I'd ever seen, we'll add some legitimate play equipment to make things more fun for you. But if you're a data geek, like we are, you'll enjoy the playground. Here's where you can play with your data by choosing different combinations of filters and other settings to sift through the ChurchNumbers database for just the events you want to summarize and to calculate your metrics as you want. And as you try different settings, you immediately see the results. We encourage you to visit the playground often and try different options. It's a great way to learn how ChurchNumbers works. But showing you how the playground works isn't really the point of this video, so we'll leave those details for another time. What we want you to understand here is how the classifiers work. In the example shown above, we haven't set any values for time block or attendee type, but we have set a filter for event type. So this metric shows only data for events where the event type is worship. And then there's another filter we set, so we're only seeing events that take place on Sunday and Saturday. So this metric searches the database and returns only worship events that took place on Sunday or Saturday, which is what you see in the list of events here in the playground. So that's classifiers. The other thing we need to discuss is attributes. Filters determine which events get pulled from the database. Attributes are the bits of data that are added up or calculated to create the numbers shown in your metrics on your dashboards. So in this example, we see that the metric is taking all those worship events and it's adding up the values recorded in their attendance attributes. Attributes can be whatever you want them to be. When you sign up for ChurchNumbers, a small number of common attributes are created for you, but you can change those and add any others that you want. Each week, you'll record attribute values for the events that take place in your church. Perhaps not all events will have values for every attribute, but every event will have at least one value. Once they're recorded, your metrics will automatically grab the appropriate records from the database, do math on their attribute values, and present the results in the metrics on your dashboards. This brings us to an important question as you consider how to set up ChurchNumbers for your church. Do we go deep or wide? Or to make it clearer, is it better to have more attributes or more events? For example, you could create a single event called Sunday, and then you could create 24 or more attributes like 9 o'clock worship attendance, 9 o'clock worship giving, 9 o'clock kindergarten attendance, 11 o'clock worship, yada, yada, yada. While this would certainly work, you may find this cumbersome to work with each week, and it places some limits on the usefulness of some ChurchNumbers features. This is how we recommend that you think about your data. You'll want to use more events when you have single bits of data that aren't really specific to a particular service, and you want the option to show more detailed breakdowns in your metrics. If you want to record multiple bits of data related to specific services, and you want to perform calculations on those bits of data, you will want to emphasize attributes over events. Of course, these options are not mutually exclusive. You can mix and match events and attributes, and you may change things over time. We're just trying to get you started with a good understanding of the options, their uses, and the implications of choosing them. Let's look at a couple of practical examples. In this first example, the church associates a number of values with each worship service: attendance, visitors, volunteers, giving, and cars in the parking lot. Therefore, they have two different worship events, 9 o'clock service and 11 o'clock service, each with its classifiers. And they have 5 attributes, with each one holding a bit of data for each service. So each week they record 5 values for each worship service. And in their metrics, they can show totals for any of the attributes, plus they can create calculated metrics for things like ratios of volunteers, visitors, or cars to attendees, per capita giving, you name it. But not every church tracks giving, parking, visitors, or volunteers specifically for every service, as in the next example. The only values this church records for specific worship services are the attendance numbers. Everything else is a total number for the week. So in this case, they've reduced the number of attributes to 3, and they've added events for weekly giving, weekly visitors, and weekly volunteers. They can use the generic attribute count for just about anything. In this case, they're recording both visitors and volunteers with the count attribute, but they could also use it to record the number of cars in the parking lot. In fact, they could reduce the number of attributes to 2 by using count for recording attendance too, but they may not want to just for clarity's sake. Remember that your metrics have different names in your attributes, so while you may have only one attribute like count to record data for a bunch of different events, you can give more descriptive names to your metrics like worship attendance, giving, visitors, and volunteers. So that's our quick primer about how to think about your data before you start setting things up in ChurchNumbers. Hopefully this was helpful. If you're scratching your head and have questions, please feel free to call or email us. We would love to help you. See you later.